Well, I'd like to turn now to some of your work on brain imaging. And I think the natural first question is, what is the Parieto-Frontal integration theory model of intelligence that you developed with, is it Rex Jung? Jung? Okay.
So way back in 2005, 2006, I had a symposium where I brought all the people doing brain imaging studies of intelligence. I invited all of them to a conference, and most of them came. And we're only talking about a handful of people. And and Rex Jung was one of them. I didn't know him before that, but in the presentations that everybody made with different imaging parameters and different tests, it became obvious that Rex and I had the same basic view that there were areas distributed around the brain that were important. It wasn't just the frontal lobes, critically important, because there a number of people thought that intelligence was a function of the frontal lobe, period. And the small number of brain imaging studies that had been done seemed to indicate a more distributed set of networks. So Rex and I actually started to review all these other papers. And we found 36 or 37 papers of using either fMRI, structural MRI, or PET to look at different tests of intelligence. And so we wrote a review article trying to go beyond the difficulties of every study had a different kind of test and a different kind of imaging. And we just looked for areas that were in common among the various studies, the areas that they showed were related to whatever test of intelligence or reasoning they had. And it turned out, just kind of counting areas, that most of the areas were in the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. Most studies found parietal and frontal areas were related to their tests of intelligence or reasoning. And there were some other areas as well. So we kind of mapped this out and published the review article and labeled this finding as a parieto-frontal integration theory, that it was how the parietal lobe talked to the frontal lobe and a few other areas that were responsible for individual differences in intelligence. And the efficiency of the connections we hypothesized based on my 1988 efficiency study. We hypothesized that the efficiency of the integration among this small set of brain areas could be the underlying neurobiological basis of intelligence in terms of brain networking. And it was the first theoretical model, if you will, or framework for brain imaging studies of intelligence. It was published in 2007, a very long time ago. And since then, a large number of brain imaging studies, over 100 easily, have tested the hypotheses that we proposed in the parieto-frontal integration theory, the PFIT model. And there is quite a bit of data now that support the idea that the parietal and frontal lobes are really key, and that the connectivity, both structural connectivity and functional connectivity among those areas, are pretty important. Now, these are all hints about what the underlying neurobiology is. So, what is the neurocircuitry in those areas? What are the neurotransmitters that are prominent, integrating information flow among these areas? So it's been a framework that has helped test hypotheses on neuroimaging. And it's gotten, the studies, I've been retired for some time. I haven't done a new study in a long time. but I am keeping up with new studies, and they are very more detailed in terms of explicating the neurocircuitry in the PFIT model and adding to the PFIT model, I should add, as you would expect over time. I attended a meeting at Edinburgh University where somebody was presenting brain imaging data. A woman who's extremely good at brain imaging data, Eureka Baston, and she presented data showing that did not support brain efficiency. And I was sitting there in the frontal row, and during the question period, I raised my hand. I said, "You probably would like to know what I'm thinking about your data that doesn't support my hypothesis." And I said, "I think it's terrific because it's just a hypothesis. The whole idea is you got to test it. And the data don't support it, and move on, and we develop, the hypothesis further." So she has data that didn't support it. Other people had data that did support it. This is the way science goes. And over time, you establish a weight of evidence. No one study is going to tell the story. Brain is complicated. You have to spend time sorting through what apparently conflicting or inconsistent results from different studies, and you develop a weight of evidence. And pretty much that's where we are on intelligence research now. It's going along pretty well. And it's very exciting, too. I mean, the idea of being able to understand reasoning ability and individual differences in reasoning ability on a neurobiological level, synaptic level, perhaps, this is way beyond what someone like Spearman could imagine. I mean, he would be delighted if he were here today.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned that I spoke with Robert Plomin about behavioral genetics, and we discussed the heredity of intelligence, which, as you already said, is, some studies suggest it's above 0.5. And we didn't discuss, though, just what the genes one inherits that result in an intelligent person code for. And essentially, do they correspond to the sorts of structures and connectivity, the neurocircuitry that's pointed to in the PFIT model, if that's the right model?
Some people have discussed some gene expression with respect to the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe. This is a very nascent field. And so if there are 1,000 genes, each with a tiny influence on intelligence or individual differences or the variance of intelligence, then you can make a list of these genes, and then you can go to the data banks where other people have studied these genes and have some idea of what they do, and you try to make a list of what the gene expressions are. I've read some of these things. They're very complicated and really beyond my ability to understand a lot of it. I've never really been trained in these fields, and they're much different now than they were when I was a student. But you can look for final common pathways. You can look, maybe you got 50 genes that are all involved in the genetic expression of postsynaptic terminals of dopamine receptors or something. So you should be able at some point to infer some hypotheses about the biologically causal, not just the influence, but causal relationships. We're not there yet. Some people think it can't be done with polygenic scores. This is a debate. I think Robert Plomin would be of the opinion that even if polygenic scores don't give insights into biological causation, they're still useful. in terms of quantifying a genetic load of something like intelligence. And it's a variable that you can use in other studies as a covariant to control for genetics. So this is relatively new, and people are working it out.
Mm-hmm. And again, totally understanding that this is a nascent area of research, but at this point, I understand that it might be possible in the future, but at this point, can brain imaging be used to predict aptitudes or various dimensions of intelligence?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but not very well.
Okay. My guess, one thing that, I mean, you've talked about this efficiency hypothesis, is that you can detect using brain imaging how efficient somebody's brain is. And this will, in general, correlate to general intelligence if the hypothesis is correct.
At some point, you might be able to define intelligence not by psychometric test score, but by quantifiable parameters of information flow around the brain while people solve a standard set of problems. That would be really cool.
Yeah, it would.
No, we're not there yet.
Hmm. And I guess this might complicate matters, but do different brains solve the same problems the same way or differently? Is this something that you're able to tell with brain imaging?
This is something I've been wanting to understand since our first brain imaging study in 1988. So if you have problems that can be solved by different strategies, then you see the different strategies being used by looking at brain imaging. The answer to this generally is yes, but still nascent. So you can, well, you know that the matrix reasoning problems can be solved verbally or visual spatially. And some people do it one way, some people do it the other way. This confounds trying to find what brain areas are involved in this test. You have to control for strategies, and there are different ways that can be done. So these are all good questions, and all good questions. And it really now depends on the focus of the investigators who have all these big data sets. And the postdocs and graduate students, they have to assign to go analyze data that would answer that question. You know, and can you sort out strategies from other data? Take a look at that. Yeah, so there are a lot of interesting questions that that still need to be addressed.
Well, I'd like to go back to Arthur Jensen, and I alluded to this question of plasticity earlier, and it's come up as we talked about early childhood education, but tying it back to the PFIT model is one of the reasons we might expect intelligence not to be highly plastic, is that it corresponds to structural features of the brain, and it's just not that easy to change the structures of the brain.
I think that's correct. It's not that easy to change brain structure or brain function in big ways. The brain is plastic. We know you can make some changes, but whether or not the plasticity extends to something as fundamental as intelligence is not so clear.
Right. I mean, if you're learning how to play the drums or something, let's say you're learning a new tune. The brain is sufficiently plastic that you can learn a new tune, but it's almost metaplasticity to be able to, because to increase your intelligence, one thing that might happen is you'd have to be able to learn just in general faster. And that's why I use the word meta. It's like a second degree of plasticity. And that's something that might really require serious structural change.
Yes, right. I mean, we don't really know, how this all works really, but step by step, we can start to figure it out. But uh, I think it will be possible. Uh, Now, would you ever want to, or if would you ever want to channel students into different ways of learning, for example, using something like polygenic scores or brain imaging? These are interesting philosophical questions. There's no practical way to do this now. Uh, I talked about the metaphorical concept of the IQ pill. Someday it may be possible to intervene in a way that will increase intelligence. Let's say it's a pill. Unlikely it's a literal pill, but metaphorically, there's some way available. And would you take it? And, would you pay for it? Would you object if it went into the water supply? Would you give it to your kids? Especially if all the other children's parents were giving it to their kids. I mean, there are a lot of questions here. It's like doping in sports and banned. So could you really enforce this in high school? Kids now take drugs because they think it improves their test performance and their IQ. I'm not sure I've seen any studies that validate that, but it's widely believed, and lots of kids have prescriptions. And they pop pills before the SAT. Now they don't have to do that anymore if the SAT's not used. So there's a lot of issues here. And, I think about them. I don't know what the answers are, but I do know that public discussion is important about the actual data, not ideas that people have that really not empirically validated.